Hey everyone, I'm Angela Lynn.
And I'm Jesse Lynn, and welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From?
Today we're talking about kids again, but in a totally different vein. We are talking about gentle parenting. So, I'm no gentle parent expert, but based on what I have read online and based on what I've seen from like some of these TikToks and whatever, the TLDR way I would describe it, I guess, is like instead of the way that we were raised, where like you do something wrong, you get fucking yelled at, potentially slapped, like, like more traditional punishment and negativity to reinforce like you shouldn't be doing XYZ. Gentle parenting is all about respecting your child and having empathy for them and communicating, if anything, kind of like over communicating of like why they're feeling certain ways, why something they did might not have been the best option for them to have done, and like making them generally understand the natural consequences of things that they do, as opposed to just saying, like, no, we don't do that. Like, because I feel like a lot of ways of traditional parenting, when you reprimand children, there isn't really an explanation, I guess, of like what you did wrong necessarily. There is just like you fucked up in some way based on like how angry your mom was or like whatever she took away from you or like whatever. But I guess as a child, especially depending on like how young you are, you wouldn't necessarily know what exactly you did wrong if they didn't exactly tell you. So gentle parenting is in theory a lot of communication, encouraging the child to like express their emotion, whether that be like even if they're crying or like yelling or whatever, kind of like letting them work through the emotions, talking through it, and then like generally being more empathetic towards them instead of just defaulting to wanting to make them shut up or like stop doing whatever thing that you are unhappy with.
I mean, I can see why it's so popular because the idea is like you're trying to build some kind of self awareness and like implicit understanding of if what you did was right or wrong. And that is so much like this segue from like mindfulness to like mental health and like personal development. And I don't mean to say those things are like negative per se, but I can see why it's so popular because this whole idea of like mindfulness, wellness, self awareness is so in vogue right now.
I feel like every parent, no matter how hard they try to do right by their child, will cause some trauma for their child because we are human. So we have plenty of our own triggers and traumas from the ways that we were brought up. And we are now working through a lot of that by becoming more self aware of what triggers us and how to control that and whatever. So the way that I'm seeing gentle parenting is almost like our generation sees the like benefit of being more in tune with ourselves, and we're trying to like push it down the line as much as possible to like as early of a developmental stage as possible, so that I guess that benefit is like more powerful and longer lasting and can reduce some of the trauma that the child otherwise would have like created in these moments instead. I guess I'm curious to see in like a couple decades time what unintended consequences may come from going about it this way, because everyone has like the best intention, right? But like you never really know what random side effects will happen from like doing one thing one way or another. But I definitely see the merits in it. And like, I don't have kids yet, but I might not follow it to a T. But I think I like the idea of at least like communicating more with a kid, because something that I've also heard from like other parents, not necessarily friends, like even on podcasts and whatever, is they're like, I talk to my child like they're an adult. Like I don't fucking like me mama them, like to like infantilize as if they can't understand stuff, because kids actually can understand a lot more than you think they can. And I've also watched these like crazy Montessori raised kids where they like are 2 years old and can like cook an omelet by themselves. Like it's just like kids have a lot of like ability, whether that be like, mental, emotional, physical, more than we give them credit for. So I'm sure there's a fine line of like making them grow up a little too fast or whatever, but like the general idea of like not talking down to your kids from like an intelligence and emotional capacity standpoint does sound appealing to me.
I just want to take it back. Like, we don't really know what the effects of different kinds of parenting will will have on different generations. Like if you think back to what was socially acceptable in like the 50s, like spanking, corporeal punishment, like we know now that that is very damaging for children, but back then it was all in vogue. Not to say that this is on the same level, but I think that it's hard to foresee the impact of what different parenting styles will have on how your child develops in the future.
Yeah, we know now, but we is also a loose term because we're talking always from an American perspective. Other countries still don't necessarily see it even the way that we see it, where physical punishment is necessarily a bad thing. I definitely remember there was a big difference between me and my brother growing up because he's 7 years older than me and he was born in Taiwan and lived there until he was 6 before my family moved here and then had me. And I remember that he was physically punished even after we moved to the US, probably because they already had that kind of like habit in Taiwan. And they told me stories about like it's normal. Maybe it's not normal anymore, but back then it was normal to hit kids, to punish them. And also, even at school, like every child was required to bring a stick to class, and the teacher was allowed to punish the child with a stick based on whatever they did wrong or got the answer wrong or whatever. And it was actually ironic. It was like the parents who gave their child the thickest stick supposedly like loved them more or like didn't want to hurt them as much because it's actually the like thin sticks that hurt the most because it's more like a whip. But anyways, so I have no idea what modern Asia or modern other countries' societies are like, but at least in the US, physical punishment is no longer the way that we treat it anymore. But even with that, like the way that we were raised, definitely, at least from my side, there was still a lot of like yelling and like general blame and shame and like negativity. And as I mentioned before, not always a lot of explanation of like exactly why what I did was wrong or like why it wasn't good enough or whatever it may be. Just that like it wasn't good and it wasn't good enough. So I do wish I had had a little bit more communication around like what exactly went wrong here and like is it necessary for you to respond this way? I don't know. Hey listeners, wondering how you can support us? The biggest way is by increasing our visibility by following us on Instagram at Where Are You From Pod, on TikTok at But Where Are You Really From, subscribing to our YouTube channel under But Where Are You Really From Podcast, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, and telling your friends. The more people we can get to listen to the show, the more we can continue spotlighting different perspectives and stories. And if you feel so inclined, we're also accepting donations at buymeacoffee.com/whereareyouFrom. Thanks y'all.
Yeah, I think the same. And depending on the situation, it was just like the order of things was wrong. So I feel like sometimes I would get the punishment first and then an explanation later. But at that point, like once you've received the punishment, you're like, wah, you're like crying or upset or whatever. The explanation afterwards, like you don't care, like, because you're not paying attention. You're like very upset. That being said, like, it's so hard to compare the things because at the end of the day, what we care about are the outcomes for our children, like who they become based off of the parenting. And it's hard to detangle how you make life choices from how you were raised. So I'm like, if I was raised in a more warm, holistic environment, would I have felt the same drive or need to leave the nest, if you will, once high school was over and go pursue what I wanted to do in New York? I think like it's really hard for me to think about like the differences and say like this might have turned out differently or what could have occurred otherwise if the parenting was different.
Yeah, it's funny, right? You can get into a whole like black hole of mental thought where you're hypothesizing different things because not specifically related to parenting, but just in general, I like frequently randomly have thoughts about like, what if this like one thing in my life had been different? Like, how would that have affected my whole life? And you just really can't know how that one specific thing would have changed everything because I have also watched other TikToks where there's one where this woman who's like in her mid-20s or whatever was talking about like how she actually has like a very good relationship with her parents. So It was a video directed at parents who are wondering why they have such shitty relationships with their adult children. And she's like, as somebody who like loves my parents and like are like essentially best friends with them, and all of our siblings like love to go home and like spend time all as a family, I can tell you that if you didn't put the time in to show them that you care and love them as when they were growing up, you should have zero expectations that they should be doing like the exact opposite of what you showed them when you were raising them, you know? And so when I watched that video, I was kind of jealous of the way that she was describing her relationship with her family. But I do agree with you that, like, who knows what things would have changed if, like, your family dynamic were completely opposite of the way that you grew up with? Like, yeah, how that would have, I'm sure it would have shaped you in a lot of positive ways, from, like, a lot more self-confidence and like self-love just inherently built in because you grew up with so much, you know, strength in that respect. But yeah, I'm like, so do you guys have independence? Like, do you have that drive to, I do wonder if certain things would be exactly opposite because of the way you were or weren't raised.
And of course there were definitely, like, I have the same memories. Like, there were moments where it's different when you look back on it, right? You look back on the memory and you're like, I can see the intention, what was trying to be done in this parent teaching moment, but how it came off was just, it wasn't the way that I needed to hear it, what I needed to understand. So I think you were saying, like, you want to know that you were raised in love, that your parents put in the time. And I don't think that just because our parents didn't parent in gentle parent style, like, they didn't do that. It was just a very different way of expressing it. So, like, I remember during Christmas, my dad had this conversation with me because I think I was kind of like, not upset, but I was kind of like, all right, well, it's like another Christmas. Like, we're not doing anything special. Like, this kind of blows. And it turned into this like weird tangent where he was basically telling me, like, I had to be there for myself because I had no siblings and we don't really have like a ton of family here. And he's like, so it's up to you. And like, you need to figure it out. And like, you have to shoulder all this burden. And I was like, bro, it's fucking Christmas. Like, why are you telling me this? Like, it was really upsetting. And I look back on it and I'm like, I kind of understand what he's saying, right? Like, he's saying, like, you need to be prepared for yourself in the future because there's not really going to be a huge support system for you from the family perspective. But that's like a parenting moment where I try to dissect it here or there. And I'm like, is this one of the reasons why I feel like why I feel really independent sometimes, where I'm just like, I don't really need to be attached to other people because of this kind of teaching style. And that has benefited me a lot, I think, moving out here, finding new pursuits, like being independent and doing what I want to do.
Bringing it back to gentle parenting. So, one of the things that we wanted to talk about was if, in theory, we tried to adopt gentle parenting, this method for ourselves, what would be the most difficult part for each of us to adapt or adopt? For me, honestly, I think it would be figuring out what punishment looks like, because I don't want a child that just like walks all over me because I'm being kind to them all the time. Like, kids do things that are wrong that they shouldn't repeat or can hurt themselves by doing certain things. And like, if you aren't able to properly communicate that like something is inherently not a good thing to do for harm reasons, or it hurts emotionally somebody else, or like whatever, how do you really convey punishment when you don't have, I don't know, it sounds really like shitty, but it's kind of like we both grew up, well, maybe not, I grew up with the fear of my mom, and like you knew that if you did something wrong, like you would suffer the wrath of mom. And I think a lot of immigrant children have this same kind of like feeling. So you inherently were kind of monitoring your own behavior because you didn't want to suffer the wrath of mom. But like, if it's a gentle parenting style, it's just like, of course I want to give my child like as much love and understanding and empathy as possible, but at the same time, like, if they're really doing stuff like they should not do for one reason or another, how do I really convey like that's a fucking no-no and you should know it's a no-no when you don't necessarily have that authority because there's no fear? Kind of sad to put it that way, isn't it? Like there's no fear of me, so you don't necessarily listen to me in that way.
Well, I think that's what's so difficult about it, right? There's not necessarily a right approach. It's kind of your creative thinking on how to formulate a solution in this case to that both reinforces good behavior, establishes yourself as the authority, and also shows the consequence. I think it's quite challenging, yeah. I would say for me, I have a very short temper. It's genetic. In my opinion, it's genetic. And for me, it would just be trying to curb all of the snide remarks that I would make or like offhand comments because I'm very snarky. And I also believe in talking to children like they're adults for the most part. And I think it's about curbing the worst tendencies in myself and like the snapback to something that someone does. Because a lot of times like you see repeat behavior and you're just like, God, this person deserves it. They deserve it. They deserve the cookies falling on their head. Like they've reached for the cookie jars 3 times. I've told them, if you reach for the cookie jar will fall into your head and then you'll be sad. And they still do it. I'd just be like, you deserved it.
So on that note, we're gonna wrap things up. So I know we went on tangents today. We kind of talked about like the topic was gentle parenting, but we also talked a lot about our own upbringings. But I think that's pretty natural because your own upbringing shapes how you see life and how you think about how you'll want to raise your own children if you plan to have children. So, listeners, we're gonna punt it back to you. I'm sure many of you had already heard of gentle parenting, but maybe some of you, this is the first time that you had heard that this is like a thing. So we're curious what you think about gentle parenting. And would you, or do you currently parent in this way? We'd love to hear pros and cons too of like people who are actually doing it because it's easy to talk about in theory, but yeah, reality of when you're like trying to do it with your kid, maybe they're just like, shut up, Bob. Like who knows? So I'd love to hear what your guys' experiences actually are. Let us know in the comments of wherever you're currently watching or listening to this on.
And as always, come back next week for a fresh new episode. And until then,
再见, bitches.